What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health, an affiliate of Mad in America Radio, broadcasting on KBOO in Oregon, sponsored by Portland Hearing Voices and the Icarus Project, and syndicated on the Pacifica Network. Madness Radio is online at kboo.fm/madnessradio and at madinamerica.com. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. Big thanks to Oddball Magazine for help with the production of this episode. Check out oddballmagazine.com. And today my guest is Adele Framer, alto strata. Adele is the founder of survivingantidepressants.org. Since 2011, Surviving Antidepressants has been helping people come off not just antidepressants, but all psychiatric medications. This is one of the leading psychiatric drug withdrawal websites in the world. There are more than 500,000 page hits a month. And this work that Adele has been doing is definitely one of the most important efforts to help people withdraw safely off of psychiatric medications. So Adele, it's great to have you as a guest today on Madness Radio.
Thank you, Will. I appreciate your giving me this opportunity to talk to you.
Adele, you're one of my teachers in this field, so I want to thank you for all of your work. And I think the essence of what you're doing is really about listening to people. And this is the most important thing that we can do in understanding how to help them. And you've helped many, many people come off psychiatric medications, reduce the harm associated, reduce the difficulty, help them make better decisions. So it's really great to have you on the show today, and we should say this is in the spirit of mutual aid and peer support. This is not medical advice or therapy or advice or any kind like that. So,
thanks, Will, and I appreciate your contributions to this area too, because the Icarus Project book was a real landmark, and you've done a lot in educating people about this issue as well, because there's got to be another way other than to be on psychiatric drugs all your life. One of the things I wanted to say is that the people who come to my website for advice would much rather be going to doctors, and we would rather send them to doctors to help them taper off of drugs. But they really have not been able to find that expertise when they go to their doctors. And I think that this is really a gap that if somehow we could communicate it to doctors, that they would be only too willing to help people if they had that knowledge. So we have to somehow break through with that.
We were saying before that you're one of the most knowledgeable people about this topic in the world, and that really speaks to how there's a tremendous gap in the knowledge. Ideally, we'd want doctors to be taking care of this and guiding people properly, but they haven't done that. And so that's why the Freedom Center and the Icarus Project and the Harm Reduction Guide to Coming Off Psychiatric Drugs and survivingantidepressants.org step in to help people where the medical system has really been failing.
Yes, absolutely. Well, as you probably know yourself, back in the early 2000s, there were a number of websites, forum websites for antidepressants had just been widely marketed. And so what happened is that after, a couple of years, people were on the antidepressants, and then they found it difficult to go off of drugs such as Zoloft or Paxil or Effexor. And so there were websites specifically for this. One of the big ones was Paxil Progress. I think that benzobuddies.org started at the same time. That's for going off of benzodiazepines. And BenzoBuddies now has around 80,000 members. It's quite large, and is probably the largest website of the kind. But survivingantidepressants.org, I think, is maybe the last website for going off of psychiatric drugs in general. A lot of the activity has moved over to Facebook.
Right.
Facebook has a platform. It has 3 billion members, so there's it's a more concentrated platform for reaching people, and these groups on Facebook arise spontaneously all the time.
Yeah, one of the things that I often say is that, this isn't 1940. You don't just go to the doctor and then receive orders about what you should be doing unquestioningly. We have a more collaborative approach these days, and we're more about thinking for ourselves and getting a second opinion. So really that's all this is about, is getting a more thoughtful perspective on the decisions that we're making medically.
Yeah, I definitely think that this is one aspect of the consumer movement that is really a revolution in the way medicine is delivered.
Mm-hmm.
With the internet, a lot of people have learned a lot more about their medical decisions. This can be a little difficult for doctors because they may be based in a traditional model where the doctor is the source of medical information, and people get told not to look at the internet. But the fact is that people are getting information from the internet. This is not going to this is a trend that's not going to go away. And they are bringing this information to their doctors for a more collaborative discussion. Some doctors are responsive to this, but with social media and the way that people can find each other on the internet, there are now communities of interest around different kinds of conditions. And going off of psychiatric drugs is one of those communities of interest.
Yeah, we should say also that this is happening throughout medicine. People are coming together to research and understand and help support each other around reducing and withdrawing their reliance on all kinds of medication, whether it's diabetes medication, blood pressure medication, epilepsy medication. There's a lot of interesting parallels. I mean, obviously they're not the same because emotional, psychological experiences are different than a physical disease process, but the parallels are very interesting to me around mutual aid group communities that emerge, the lifestyle changes, learning about going slow, support. So I also want to say that the work that you're doing now is also going into the research field. So I want to thank you for the work that you're doing, bringing your perspective as a survivor and as a community guide and facilitator into emerging research around psychiatric medication withdrawal.
Well, you're welcome. That actually is deliberate because many years ago, I came off of Paxil in 2004 and developed severe withdrawal syndrome. It took me many years to recover. And during that time, I did a tremendous amount of research. And I came to realize that we needed to collect case histories and about withdrawal syndrome. I had joined Paxil Progress because I came off of Paxil and got peer support there. After being a member of the committee for 5 years, I eventually came to establish my own website specifically to capture those case histories. We have a section of the website which is called Introductions, where people journal more or less their progress. And that, I believe, is it's an incredible store of information about how people think of themselves while they're going through this process, their realizations as they go along, as well as their tapering experience or their withdrawal experience, and how they cope with those symptoms, which are really unusual symptoms. Every one of those introductions topics is one person's journey. They're just amazing. They're just incredible. Many of the circumstances are heartbreaking. People can be disabled from going off of psychiatric drugs, or they have a difficult time tapering. So there are all those problems that people have when they're dealing with chronic conditions and how they learn to cope with that. And fortunately, we also have success stories where people come out of the other side after possibly many years of these difficulties. It's really amazing. But for medicine, what we have is the arc of tapering and recovery from withdrawal, and I think that those are really important.
You mentioned something really important, which is that when the antidepressants, the SSRIs, first came out, there was zero medical recognition about the difficulty of withdrawal. And people would go to their doctor and they would say, I'm having all these different side effects, I'm having all these problems. and they would literally be treated as if they were crazy, or it's just in your head, you're making it up, or these are symptoms, or now you have an additional disorder, a delusion about your withdrawal. And that happens throughout psychiatry and throughout mental health care. And so the work of survivingantidepressants.org has really helped to get the word out and generate this undeniable documentation that, yes, the reality is that these drugs do have withdrawal effects. And then it becomes a political struggle with the pharmaceutical industry and their products and the psychiatric establishment. And they really need to start recognizing that, yes, you can be disabled from antidepressants. It does happen to some people. And I think that there's starting to be a little bit more of that recognition, but it's up to the citizen science, in a sense, to get these stories out there, so that patients aren't just being told that the problem is in their head, or it's not real, or you actually need to take more medications. That no, actually, these drugs have serious side effects, including dependency creating effects that can cause all kinds of withdrawal problems, including long-term prolonged withdrawal problems.
There is a body of research about gleaning information for post-marketing surveillance from social media. Now we have informatics looking at social media in order to find out certain kinds of epidemiological trends. Mm-hmm. And one branch of that is looking at social media to find information for post-marketing surveillance. Post-marketing surveillance means that, like as you say, after the drug is approved, after a fairly, it's a very laborious process from the pharmaceutical company's point of view, but after not much testing on not many people. And then, so especially in the case of, let's say, these antidepressants, they eventually get prescribed to millions of people to be taken for very long periods of time that were never tested. Mm-hmm. And the adverse effects of that emerge in a very informal way. That you can see them on social media, except if they get, say, reported to the FDA, which is another problem because the FDA doesn't actually analyze their reports. So medical informatics can look at social media to capture this information that happens after the drug is marketing and has been out in the wild for some years, to see what long-term effects have been.
It actually is a bit of a gold rush right now, social media as a source of researching medical issues, researching medications is happening throughout medical science. And there are these giant artificial intelligence data mining companies that, go through your Facebook posts and your Twitter posts. And if you read the terms of service on those sites, you're basically signing away your rights to privacy in a lot of cases. And sure, they disguise your name and they protect your anonymity, but it has a sinister side to it.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of this investigation is being done by researchers at universities. So they're publishing papers, and it's very promising, but it's like it hasn't really been incorporated into, I guess, what you might call the system yet.
Yes, there is a disincentive to look at the actual impact of the drugs when they're released, because then the pharmaceutical industry is going to have to look at the dark side of the drugs, and it's going to be incontrovertible, the evidence that's coming out of social media and people's experience. And now they don't have this sweet deal as much as they did before, where they could just release a drug, get it past the FDA, which they influence unduly and manipulate and control politically, and then kind of ignore the patient voice. Now the patients are more organized. There's more careful documentation that's easily researched and collated and searched and analyzed as data. So I think that there is some change starting to happen in the way in which pharmaceutical products are brought to market and the way in which they are monitored for their impacts and effectiveness and side effects, just because of the nature of social media and the internet.
Yeah, there's a lot of political maneuvering in drug approval, but it's unlikely that pharma would fund this post-marketing surveillance. So it would have to come from governments.
Yeah, and there is a kind of a sinister side of this. It is surveillance, and people, for example, may have their language analyzed on the internet. If certain keywords are being used, then it may trigger a medical intervention. Oh, this person has a certain percentage statistical likelihood of being suicidal because we've analyzed these words that they use in their post, or they post at certain times of day, they're online at certain times of day. Oh, suddenly now they're online in the middle of the night, posting a certain volume on social media, interacting with the internet at a certain velocity. And so we're going to jump to the conclusion that, well, statistically, given their history, it's likely that they're having a manic episode, so we're going to intervene medically. So there's a real tremendous dark side to this, the way in which diagnosis and surveillance through our lives being more and more on the internet leads to potentially very intrusive and repressive kinds of medical interventions. I wanted to start just our interview. I've had Laura Delano on the show a few times. I've had Monica Cassani, a number of people who've really studied psychiatric drug withdrawal and mutual aid work around psychiatric drug withdrawal. And I wanted to start with this whole idea of the recipe. And a lot of people begin, they say, okay, I'm on this drug. Here's the drug. Here's my dosage. Give me the recipe. What do I have to do right? How do I come off of it perfectly? What is the exact correct thing that I can do that will mean that I come off successfully? And unfortunately, that's not the nature of these drugs. That's not the nature of individual human variation. And there really isn't a recipe.
The way that people relate to their medical authorities is that, we have a tradition of trusting what the doctor tells us, and the doctor usually gives us very clear instructions about what to do. A lot of people really want that kind of, let's say, guided decision from their doctor. They don't want to have to make the decision themselves. They want the doctor to give them a recommendation, which they usually take as, informed, and they follow it. So when they come to surviving antidepressants, though, a lot of the people that join already have gotten instructions from their doctors about tapering and failed at it. And they have experienced withdrawal symptoms, and they are terrified of withdrawal symptoms. It's really hard for me to understand why doctors have been able to shrug this off for so long. The new age antidepressants were first marketed in the late 90s, so we're going into 25 years of probably patients going to their doctors and saying, doctor, I followed your instructions to reduce this drug and I'm getting these zap feelings in my head. And the doctor, might tell them, that's your imagination or something like that. But it's, those brain zaps are a documented withdrawal syndrome. Anyway, so the symptoms are quite strange, and they can be really, really painful and distressing. So people, they might have reduced their drug by 25%, which is a fairly typical reduction, and they go back on it. And fortunately for withdrawal, going back on the drug tends to at least reduce the withdrawal symptoms. That's the only remedy, by the way, that medicine knows, is returning to the drug.
Or they might add a second drug. Oh, you're having delusions. Your bipolar is now uncovered. Here, let's give you a new drug to sleep. And that, well, because you need the drug, this is your depression telling you need to stay on the drug.
Well, yeah, and that's another strange thing, too, because no matter how strange the symptoms are that the patient might be reporting, the doctor will say that it's your depression talking.
Yeah, and there's no way to really predict who's going to be in that 25% of having an easier time, who's going to be in that 25% of having a harder time. There's other factors that one person is experiencing memory problems or sexual problems. They might be more inclined to tolerate those effects and go with a slower taper, or another person might I need to go faster. I can't really deal with these side effects. So there's also the choice that the individual makes based on their own pluses and minuses, the balance of what they want to do, what's acceptable to them, their life circumstance. Some people may have pressures on them being able to work or take care of children is an incredible pressure that people might want to go more quickly. But you have to say that there's a tremendous ambiguity, and it's really this uncertainty about what is going to happen in the withdrawal process or staying on the drug. That means that it's very hard for people to face the complexities of withdrawal. And the inclination of a lot of people is just to want to put the authority into the medical provider and put them in the position of power of knowing the answer. And they don't know the answer. You really have to navigate this at the end of the conversation yourself. You're the one who's making that decision about how to approach this.
So when people come, they usually have experienced some kind of a medical failure in that they've attempted to reduce their drugs but gotten really scary symptoms from it, or take the drug and then they get withdrawal symptoms just from skipping a day or two, and then they become disenchanted with the drug and they never want to take it again. Or they may have a very, very common side effect, which is sexual dysfunction, and they want to reclaim their sexuality. Initially, when they come to the website, they think what they want is clear instructions about how to go off. And over the years, and this is something that's really come out of the grassroots of patient wisdom, people seem to have a lot of difficulty with the usual instruction of cut your dose in half, and then a week later cut it in half again, and then go off. So that is obviously too fast because people get withdrawal from that. So maybe 25% of the population might be able to go off that fast, but then there's like about 50% in the middle that are going to have a lot of trouble with it, and then 25% at the end that are going to need much, much, much slower tapering. So over the years, the patients have found that reduction of 25% were too much. This is a completely arbitrary decision. So we suggest trying an initial reduction of 10%, and that's of the original dosage, and see what happens. What we found is that through observing people tapering, that it can take maybe even a month for withdrawal symptoms to show up. So you wouldn't want to taper faster than a reduction every month. These, come from patient observations. These aren't hard rules because, as I said, like perhaps 25% don't need that slow a taper. But being peer advisors, we don't want to lead people into hurting themselves. So we err on the side of caution.
Yeah, in my own work, I'm often putting a lot of qualifiers. I suggest something that I see from my observation, something from my own experience, but then I also say, look, this can't predict what you're going to go through or what your experience is going to be. I don't want to overstate what is known and really not convey that this is often a mysterious process that's unpredictable.
Right. So, I've been accused of being rigid about this, but we're just suggesting that you start with 10% because from our observation, that seems to be safe for most people. We try to make that clear, but still people assign even peer counselors an air of authority, so sometimes they miss the qualifiers and they think that they're being told. But so we publish this, and the Icarus Guide is one of our sources for this information. And we also advocate that your next reduction be smaller than your first reduction. So if you're if you start out with, let's say, 10 milligrams of something, your first reduction would be 1 milligram. That's 10% of 10 milligrams. Your next reduction would be 10% of 9 milligrams. So it would be 0.9 milligrams. And your next reduction after that would be 10% of 8.1 milligrams. So that would be about 0.8 milligrams. So it keeps on getting smaller. The reduction keeps on getting smaller as you go on, because that's proportionate to the amount of the drug that's in your system, right?
Right, because if you just did 10% each time, then each reduction would be a larger percentage of what remains in your system, because you start to have less of the drug in your system and you're actually going, in a sense, faster. So that hyperbolic pace can be really important.
It would be like going down the stairs where the depth of the step keeps on getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So it makes it harder for you to go down. This results in, if you're going to do the math, it's an exponential taper, and it results in what's called a hyperbola. And as it turns out, this method, which was developed from the grassroots and is sort of intuitive, actually matches the hyperbola that is the basis of a paper that was published in 2019 by Mark Horowitz and David Taylor in Lancet about tapering antidepressants. It corresponds to psychopharmacological principles having to do with saturation of the serotonin receptors and then backing out of that saturation. There's documentation that shows why this makes sense. After that paper was published, and also due to quite intense lobbying by patient groups in the UK, the Royal College of Psychiatrists came out with advice about slower tapering, and that a hyperbolic taper is one of their sources for that advice. So there's been some progress made in the United Kingdom having to do with slower tapering of antidepressants, and Mark Horowitz and David Taylor also came out with another one about tapering antipsychotics. It has not yet been tested in a large controlled study, but there are so many millions of people on the drugs, it's like to help them, because not all of those people are going to need to stay on those drugs all their lives. So it's kind of a stake in the ground. We're going to do this hyperbolic taper.
It also does seem that the length of time that the person has been on the drug relates to how difficult it can be to come off of it and having more serious withdrawal effects. But that might also just be a general statement that is not really a strict, rigid rule.
Well, that would be a hypothesis, being that the people on my website are not like they're not a random sample. So I can't say what I'm seeing doesn't confirm it, because I have people who have trouble going off the drugs after they've been taking them for 8 months. I have people who have trouble going off after 1 month. I had trouble going off of Paxil after taking it for, I think, like about 2.5 years. So it could be a combination. Length of time on the drug might be a factor. It's certainly, the longer you're on the drug, the more your body might adapt to it. And it's the adaptation that, having to back out of the adaptation that causes withdrawal symptoms. But there may be individual neurological differences where some people adapt faster than others. And also, personally, I think that a history of drug switches, adverse effects, withdrawal symptoms, going on and off of drugs, I think that history is significant. So there may be several factors. And ultimately, when you have several factors involved, you end up with a matrix that's so complex, it may be difficult to predict for any individual if they're going to have difficulty or not, even when all of this is unraveled.
Yeah, and then there are these social factors, which are really important contributors to this. I mean, isolation and lack of really meaningful connection in life, we know, is an incredible, powerful factor in negative health effects. So people's social connection is really important in the withdrawal process, although we tend to think of withdrawal just about dosages and exposure and rates of tapering. But actually, the social factors are extremely important, and different people are going to be in different situations and related to that. We have the example of alcohol, and there's an understanding that different people are going to have different paces, different approaches, different needs in alcohol reduction if you're someone who's using alcohol in a way that's destructive in your life. And yes, AA is helpful for some people, just quit the alcohol and, stay abstinent, but that's actually not the best for everybody. Some people need a different approach. So we know from the realm of addictionology and dealing with problematic substances in people's lives that everyone's really different. And so we really need an individualized approach where doctors, providers are really responsive to the individuality of the patient, and also an approach that looks at the person in their life context. And that's why I think that the mutual aid work of websites like survivingantidepressants.org is so crucially important, because that has a direct impact on health.
That is absolutely true. And the fact is that if, I guess I should say, when doctors do take over the responsibility of tapering, they will have to very, very closely work with the patient. And this is going to be a very different model for them. They are going to have to keep in touch with the patient to find out if, first of all, they're going to have to be able to recognize withdrawal symptoms, which is one piece of the education. But the other is that they're going to have to listen to the patient's report. And of course, patients don't have a technical language to describe withdrawal symptoms, so they're going to describe it in their own subjective ways. But they're going to have to listen to the patient as an individual. And if the person is having trouble with the taper, they're going to have to adjust the taper. And that might mean tapering more slowly, or just stopping the taper for a while and letting the nervous system settle down. But this means that each individual taking a psychiatric drug is going to have that individualized attention. But the promise of these drugs, and this is one of the, I guess you could say, the crime, is that they were mass marketed. They don't need that individualized attention. The whole idea is that you could rip off, a prescription for 20 milligrams of citalopram and keep on refilling that for years and not worry about it. So when doctors take this over, they're going to have to work really closely with the patients to do it right, which will make the whole proposition of prescribing antidepressants or other psychiatric drugs a lot more time-consuming and a lot more complicated, and that affects the risk-benefit assessment. It's not going to be easy to carry this person for years through this drug. So is it possible that this person, their issues could be resolved with non-drug treatments that don't require the attention of a highly credentialed medical professional who's quite expensive?
Yeah, like helping them with a job, or getting out of poverty, or no longer being in an abusive relationship, or dealing with trauma, all these different social factors. It's not just like, an antibiotic and an infection, or bringing down a fever or blood pressure. That's a mechanistic model of machine malfunction caused by diseases. And so the reality is that the person's life, their life experience, is really implicated in this conversation. When we talk about depression, I mean, wow, depression can be so many different things. I'm working with a number of people and myself as well. The whole relationship between depression and grief, very clear. People have loss in their lives. Are we just going to hand them a pill and say, okay, this is a disease because you meet the criteria for clinical depression, or are we going to actually recognize that there's a grieving person? There's someone who's actually suffered some kind of loss, or is facing some kind of oppression, or is facing some kind of life circumstance that is pressurizing them? Or are we just going to say, okay, this is depression, let's think of it as a disease, let's put you on a pill? And I also think that understanding that the withdrawal process also is about empowerment, connection, community, social context, social factors, issues of privilege. And so being able to grapple with all that takes us far beyond the simple prescription pad. If someone has different life circumstances, they're going to have a different experience. And depression can mean, for example, anger, and they need a certain amount of validation of that anger and a recognition that working with their anger or expressing their anger or being in touch with their anger may be crucial to helping them to live without antidepressants. So I think that the role of doctors maybe is important, because there needs to be some kind of gatekeeper around the pill, but ultimately the community, a well-resourced community, not an exploited, oppressed community, but a supported community, is going to have to really play a central role in developing the self-care that people need to be able to live without medications and move on when they've been on medications, deal with problems like depression?
Going off of the drugs is a type of passage, and of course, a lot of people initially went on the drugs for some trouble, and when they go off of them, they're faced with challenges that might bring up difficulties that they've had for a long time in terms of, let's say, coping with a sense of helplessness or pain. One thing that's very, very common is that people, they don't know what will happen. We can't promise them exactly what will happen. They have to feel their way along and experience withdrawal symptoms in order to get their arms around the process. So we say, make that first reduction and then see what happens. And, it's interesting because it involves how people think of themselves and their capabilities and the way that they solve problems and their relationship to authority and, their own self-confidence. And what's really amazing is that we see people going through this process coming out really transformed by it in truly amazing ways, and that they find out so much about themselves and sometimes resolve things, that have been troubling them for a very, very long time.
Yeah, I'm glad that you pointed that out, because when we take these medications, they are drugs, and they can put the brakes on things, and it can be useful to put the brakes on things, but you can also block a process, or you can suppress a process, and you may need to deal with that thing that's being suppressed. Like, for example, there's so many young people that I work with who want to come off their medication, or they don't want to take medication. And really, it's just about a young person finding their independence. It's about finding your identity in the world, moving out of childhood, being able to make a decision. This is my decision. And so if we miss that part, we miss the fact that it's not just what's the right thing to do about meds. It's about supporting the person in finding that independence and finding that voice and that separation from the authority of their parents, which is so crucial for so many of us in the developmental process of moving out of adolescence and moving in to adulthood.
Will, this makes me a little teary, because I think that what we've managed to develop on survivingantidepressants.org is that kind of community. The members of the community are encouraging each other to learn and to transcend and to accept and to cope with not only the problems of withdrawal, but also issues in their daily lives. All of those ways that people can grow. And that really is a beautiful thing. It can be so very painful, though. But fortunately, as I said, we have probably about 150 success stories where people, in retrospect, look back on that whole process, which I think are just extremely, extremely precious. I appreciate it so much when people come back and tell us how they're doing, how they've recovered and how they've moved on.
And doctors are completely ill-equipped. I mean, through no fault of their own. I mean, the society is directing people with emotional distress to the wrong place for help. Doctors aren't really in a position to help you with the parenting issue, or to help you with a question of how do you gain empowerment against bullies, or how do you get back in touch with your dreams, or how do you deal with a big setback in your career. What do you deal with the fact that you're at a dead-end job and you don't have a union and you're really worried about your future financially? Is a doctor really in a position to really help you with that? No, the community is really the direction you need to go, the connection. And I think we also lose sight of the fact that the role of the community is often to help us through these passages, that the history of human suffering is also the history of people learning through suffering and going through ordeals as growth experiences. And we've lost that completely in the psychiatric framework. It's just the machine is broken, let's fix it with a pill, rather than this is a life experience. Yeah, we want to help you as much as we can, but also the work here is to find meaning in this, to find connection around it, to find purpose, that maybe you're going to grow as a person. Maybe there are even some positive things. I mean, ordeals and suffering can make us stronger and make us wiser. And that's how we grow. We grow by getting some pushback from life. And so we begin to really lose that in the whole medical framework of depression and mental illness and psychiatric diagnosis, and how do we fix our symptoms? How do we make ourselves into productive, performing, functional human beings, rather than understanding that, look, you're a human being. You have a whole life. This is part of your growth. It's part of your learning. It's part of the question that has been facing humanity since the beginning of how do we respond to suffering? What is the meaning of suffering? Why do I suffer? Why me and not you? What's the difference? What did I do wrong? Did I do something wrong? Is there a God? What's the meaning of my life? A pill's not going to answer those questions for you.
Yeah. Well, protracted withdrawal syndrome occurs across all psychotropics, including those that are addressed by addiction medicine. It's a common characteristic of all the psychotropics. It has not been recognized in the psychotropics that are supposedly therapeutic, because I should say there's been tunnel vision about how the benefits of the drugs rather than the drawbacks of the drugs, and of course virtually no attention given to how to come off of the therapeutic psychotropics, which psychiatric drugs are among them, but there are also opioids and so forth. So we're actually in, I think, quite a bit of a crisis right now, because there are so many people on so many different kinds of psychotropics. And there are some issues about coming off that we recognize, or that are starting to be recognized now. But anyway, I actually had the honor of co-authoring a paper with Michael Hentgartner recently about protracted withdrawal syndrome from antidepressants, and it was based on 69 cases from my website. And what we found was that, and this is, 69 is a pretty healthy number of cases, but we could certainly use a larger study on this, that it seems to take about 2 or 3 years to recover from protracted withdrawal syndrome. There are people who, of course, take much longer. I personally, after I came off of Paxil in 2004, it took me 11 years to feel that was in the background. Although I say I've recovered after 11 years, different things still kept on improving after 11 years.
Yeah.
Which is fortunate for me, because, of course, over 11 years I aged. So after 11 years, I could say that it wasn't in the foreground of my life anymore. But it's really hard for people, because there's no way to speed it up, really. What you need to do is to take care of yourself in ways, that support your nervous system healing itself. It needs to reassemble itself. And gentle exercise, if you can handle it, is one of those ways. That's really good for your nervous system, to get some exercise. We try to get people to, it's really, really hard, because it's such a distressing condition. People can be disabled from it, and then they, they lose their livelihoods, their family lives fall apart. And on top of that, it's not recognized. They are hungry for validation. We have quite a few people with protracted withdrawal syndrome on my website. It's very hard for them to feel that they're seen. It's a really, really difficult condition to be in. And I know I personally kept working for 4 years through protracted withdrawal syndrome. And I think that there are probably many, many people struggling with it who don't really understand what they have.
Again and again and again, I talk with people in my private practice, people in classes and groups and support groups, and people that I meet. And again, it's, I was suffering something from my drug, and my doctor just said, no, that's not it. There's a dismissal that it's the drug, or the person's actually put on more drugs or gets a more serious diagnosis. Oh, you had a manic reaction to your Prozac, but we're actually going to blame that on your bipolar illness has been uncovered, rather than recognizing that actually the drug itself could be causing it. And someone goes down what we often refer to as the rabbit hole. The drug is the problem, but now the drug is presented as the solution, and now you go down onto more drugs and switching drugs and new diagnoses and new drugs for the new diagnosis that you're on.
Well, I think that treatment-resistant depression is quite common. It's quite often called treatment-resistant depression because one of the extremely common results of going off of psychiatric drugs, even if you don't have particularly difficult withdrawal symptoms, is an emotional anesthesia. It's not dysthymia. There's a demotivation aspect to it because you don't get a sense of reward from anything, even stuff that you used to really like. Even if you had been incredibly depressed prior than going off drugs, there's something that you liked, flowers, or you like puppies or something, but you cannot feel anything in this condition of emotional anesthesia after going off of the drugs, except maybe really negative emotions like fear or worry about what's going on with you. And this is a post-drug condition that is extremely distressing to people. It's not as obvious as like some of the physical symptoms. And by the way, it's also common in addiction medicine after people go off of those drugs.
Yeah, we need to have honesty about the risk of protracted withdrawal syndrome. It's not something that's predictable. It seems to be a risk that everyone who takes antidepressants faces. And then I just say, well, maybe these drugs shouldn't even be on the market. Because let's imagine the standard for other products. If we had a car, for example, and you sell 10,000 cars and 9,999 of them are fine, but one of them explodes and horribly burns all the occupants of the car, are you going to sell that car? Is that car going to be on the market? No, 1 in 10,000 is too high a risk. But for some reason, when it comes to so-called mental patients, we sort of say, well, they're mental patients, or depression is worse, or, these drugs are so important. We have made so many advances. And the reality is that no, these products don't meet the standards of just basic safety, and they certainly don't meet the standards of do no harm, which should be the cornerstone of the medical profession. So I just wanted to ask you, what do you think about that, about just marketing antidepressants in general?
That the marketing is, when you say marketing, I say it was a horrible mistake to allow pharmaceutical companies to market them in the first place. I mean, marketing is one thing. Getting them approved and allowing them to be tools used by doctors is another thing. I guess everywhere psychiatric drugs have been extremely aggressively marketed in every possible way that they could be marketed. And as a result, we have extraordinary numbers of people taking them. And incidentally, all of this activity by the pharmaceutical companies, which has been, they've spent billions of dollars on this over 25 years, has changed our culture completely. That there's just a fundamental assumption that, that if you have a problem, you take a drug and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I'm thinking of someone I worked with recently who was told that, you are depressed, you have clinical depression. If you don't take an antidepressant, you're going to harm your child that you are pregnant with, your unborn child. You're going to harm your unborn child if you don't take the antidepressant because, depression is this terrible illness that causes all these negative effects on children. I mean, the incredible twisted logic that goes on in the medical profession. And of course, the other side of this, I mean, these are drugs. They are chemicals that you put into your body, and they may have effects, especially if they have tranquilizing effects, or people often report numbing effects, or maybe there's a placebo effect associated with it. And yeah, you need something to help you deal with your life. And so I'm glad people are grabbing a hold of something, but we're doing it as a society in a really dishonest way, and we're not giving people other options and other resources because we're not actually looking at what the real problem is, that society is depressing. Life is depressing. People need help with life, especially in a hyper-exploitive, super materialistic, ecocidal, frankly, ecologically catastrophic civilization, that there needs to be more of a recognition that we need social change, not brain change, to deal with these issues. One thing I want to ask you that I think comes up now is that there are people who are on, say, antidepressants, and they start to learn about the dangers and risks of withdrawal. And then they say, well, wait a second, maybe it's not even worth it. Maybe the risks of withdrawal are worse than staying on the drug. I'm so terrified of coming off this drug. What if the situation gets even worse? I mean, it's a terrible, terrible dilemma to put people in. What would you say to someone who comes away from this conversation or other conversations with that message? Oh, it's just better to stay on drugs because withdrawal is such an incredibly risky process.
Well, that's a tragedy, the way that we're living now. That person has to make that decision for themselves because there aren't any promises about coming off of the drugs. Ordinarily, adverse effects of drugs, actually psychiatric drugs, reduce if you reduce the dosage. So it's possible if someone is suffering adverse effects that if they very, very carefully reduce the dosage, such as this 10% hyperbolic taper per month, that they might get to a level where the adverse effects are reduced and they're more tolerable. So that is, I think that's a relatively low risk way of seeing if you might be able to circumvent the adverse effects without going off the drug completely. You could just lower it part way, but you'd have to do it really carefully because you don't want to trigger withdrawal symptoms, while you're reducing.
Yeah, and of course the problem is that what you're doing is you're continuing to expose yourself to a drug, maybe at a lower dosage, but you still are exposing yourself to the drugs. And what's the new adverse effect or the worsening effect that might come on next? So what might happen if you stay on the drug longer that might then even contribute to even worse withdrawal effects? So it's a maddening, horrible dilemma. People are really in a bind. Bad option A, bad option B, bad option C. And they get stuck in this confused state. Wow, what do I do? I'm scared. And then in steps false authority in the form of the medical professional, as the expert, telling them what to do. And then they grab a hold of it and then they just may continue to the situation gets worse. And I think the heart of the dilemma is that we're just not honest with people about what we don't know. We're not honest with people about the diversity of responses. Some people take antidepressants, they don't have a problem. It helps them or doesn't help them. They stop taking them, they throw them away. They don't have a problem. There are those people out there. And other people have the complete opposite end of the spectrum. It destroys their life. So we have to be honest about that. But I think that the pharmaceutical industry, the hospital, the insurance industry, the medical professionals, psychiatry, they don't want to really face that because their entire paradigm starts to crumble. Because then people say, well, why are you exposing people to these incredible risks? What are you doing, destroying these people's lives? And then saying, well, it doesn't happen to everybody, or a lot of people get benefit. No, that's a terrible. It's a corrupt calculation, and it should not be done. And it also should certainly not be done if it's wrapped in this dishonesty and this failure to actually inform people what the actual risks are. And then on top of the whole insult, when people do get into a problem and they do need help, zero resources, zero recognition, zero acknowledgement, zero services, zero places for people to go.
Right, exactly. That is just a fact of life these days, is that you're going to have to assess that risk for yourself. We don't pressure anybody into going off of the drug.
Exactly. Basic harm reduction. You don't assume one is better than the other. There's risk in all directions. So you have to let people figure it out for themselves. There's a risk involved, and that's just part of, I hate to say it, but that is kind of built into what life is. Life is about risks and unknowns. Can we minimize those risks? Yes. And can we get information to make informed choices about those risks? Yes, but we also have to face the unknown, and we have to face the possibility that unexpected things are going to happen, that there may be risks that we can't foresee, or that risks that play out in ways that we wish they hadn't.
Right. And there is an argument that if someone has been taking psychiatric drug or combination of drugs for years and is not having significant adverse effects, not to upset the apple cart. It's a completely personal, individual decision about, how do you feel now that you're taking the drug? Like, can you tolerate the uncertainty of reducing? And finally, like, do you want to try life without the drug? Because in fact, they do have effects, and some people like the effects. So that's an individual thing. I'm not going to say that nobody should be taking them, because I can't make that decision for individuals.
Yeah, it gets very complicated with antipsychotics because people might look at their life before they took the antipsychotic drug, and they had a horrible roller coaster nightmare experience with an extreme state, that they interacted with the police. They just devastated their work situation. They terrified their family. They had this horrific nightmare experience in the hospital, and they're like, no, I'm holding on to this antipsychotic because it's keeping me stable. And that's a reasonable calculation to make. But if we leave people alone with that calculation and we don't present to them, well, actually, maybe there's some middle ground between back in the hospital or stay over medicated, then we're just really neglecting them. And I think we're failing as a society. I mean, I see this happen quite a lot, especially with people who have experiences that get called mania, and they end up on lithium, or they end up on an anticonvulsant, anti-epileptic drug like Depakote or Lamictal. And yeah, those drugs will keep you tranquilized to a certain level, that they can prevent a certain recurrence of a certain wild manic state. There's no doubt about that. They have that tranquilizing quality, and they come at a terrible cost. They can suppress your life force. They can cause cognitive impairment. They can kill you. They can cause all kinds of serious toxic effects on your body. But now that you've been on the drug, you may have a worse propensity. You may have a greater vulnerability to going into a manic state because of the changes in your chemistry and your brain chemistry that the drug has caused. And so now what do you do? These are very complicated decisions. And it does seem that going slow and learning different coping mechanisms, learning different supports, learning different tools, managing sleep is really crucial. Maybe also having an emergency backup drug to interrupt that sleep deprivation that might throw you back into the crisis. But these are very complicated decisions. It's not a decision that I would make for the person. I never say it's better to be on or off a drug. I say, look, let's talk about your life. I'll help you try and understand the situation better, and then help maybe you can make a more informed, careful, thoughtful decision. I'll do my best I can, but I can't make that decision for you. And then sometimes people get to this place where they're just like, look, I just want to go to rehab. I just want to go to a sanctuary. And definitely we need sanctuaries. We need soteria houses. We need these hospital alternatives, peer respites. We need places that people can go and be safe and not have to work and help be taken care of and supported, and they absolutely need that. And it does kind of fit into the rehab model of addictionology, where you think you're just going to go to rehab, you're going to have this ordeal in rehab, and then it's going to be solved. And that, I usually don't see that being how it works. I mean, sometimes that works for people, but the research is pretty bad on that approach to recreational substances. And I also don't think that's necessarily the best approach for coming off of psychiatric drugs, but we may need those backup places. We need those places that we can go. So if we become suicidal, or if the so-called psychotic symptoms get really extreme, I have those resources available to me. And that fundamentally, this is a point that I'm coming to again and again, is that we're just not devoting the resources to these issues that we need to. And people in agencies or in programs or in different projects that are getting funded, they will hear, well, we don't have it in the budget. We just don't have the resources. Well, it's not true. The U.S. is the richest country in the world. There's plenty of resources. We can absolutely afford this. We can absolutely afford to take care of people. In fact, it's their right. People have a human right to good health care. We don't even provide universal health care for people. We don't even provide a living wage. You can work full time in the United States and be in poverty. You can raise children in poverty. It's no fault of their own. and the child is in poverty. So we have some serious problems with the way in which resources are distributed and allocated and focused in our society. And that's a political issue. Those are decisions that are made politically at the top of the economy. They're made at the top of the hierarchy, the top of the capitalist system. And this is why I think these discussions have to come back to the question of movements. We have to be starting to build power and make real changes. I mean, people say, well, the idea, you talk about breaking the power of the pharmaceutical industry, prying the grip of the pharmaceutical industry out from the regulatory process of the FDA and ending this dominance of pharma in our society. That is so pie in the sky. That is just talk. That is airy. Well, actually, I remember the presidential primaries in the election that we just had. There was a lot of talk about that. There was a lot of talk about being able to have universal health care, Medicare for all, change the political corruption situation, go really in the direction of universal health care. And there was a lot of talk about ending the dominance of big pharma over our healthcare decisions. So no, this stuff is only impossible when we make it impossible by not talking about it.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that what we need are more communities of support of all types. I think that we're in a period now where we've gotten to peak psychotropic, and although it seems as though there's always, more room for the market to grow, but if you think about it, there are about 15% of the adult population is taking antidepressants alone. And then on top of that, there are all the other drugs. And then on top of that, there are people who are taking the unofficial unprescribed psychotropics. It must be like a quarter of the population.
Yeah, if you add alcohol and caffeine, we're a totally stoned high society, or tobacco or binging on Netflix. I mean, people are altering their states. I mean, that's what it's all about in our society.
So, we're just talking about things that come in capsules or tablets. So, we're talking like an immense number of people, but there's no exit strategy. It's only recently that it's been discovered that opioids need to be tapered, which would have been a no-brainer for somebody with any practical frame of mind.
I mean, pharmaceutical industry has a business model, sell drugs. That's what they do. And they're just going to keep that rolling unless there's some kind of regulatory apparatus above them that changes the rules of the game. And they're just going to keep pushing that. And that's what they're doing with psychedelic drugs, the psilocybin mushrooms and LSD. And look, let's be really clear. LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, the side effect profile is way safer, so much safer than antipsychotics or SSRIs or benzodiazepines. But I'm deeply suspicious of how pharma is going to use and turn this new market around psychedelics into a medicalized treatment for diseases way of addressing it. I'm against the war on drugs, that people need to have access to these substances without fear of criminal prosecution. We need to figure out how to do that. But ultimately, if you're pitching it all as, oh, there's more drugs, different kinds of drugs, maybe safer drugs or more interesting drugs to deal with your brain problem, then we're missing the fundamental question, which is that our communities are sick. Our communities are in trouble. We don't have a lifestyle. We don't have an economy that serves basic needs.
Right. Well, as a baby boomer, I have some informal experience with many of those psychedelics. And I agree with you that it's far, far preferable that people have an occasional dose of a psychedelic rather than a daily dose. It's the daily dose problem. The daily dose is what causes dependency. So I say, if somebody finds that mescaline, gives them relief for 6 months or whatever, why not? I don't really have a problem with that. However, there is a documentation that there's probably a subset of people who are, that single dose will be a problem for them.
Yeah, it's true with the antipsychotics. A single dose can cause problems for some people. It's a small number of people, but they're out there, and there's no predicting. It's a gamble.
Well, as far as I know, nobody has actually looked at this. I think it's really important. Psychopharmacology should really be interested, if they want to find out, like it could very well be a genetic subset. And that would be one situation where these gene analysis might be really handy.
Very hypothetical. That would be great. I don't see it to be true. It's possible, or just at least to know what the risk factors are, to fundamentally just not get people on these drugs to begin with, to find alternatives at the very beginning of the process, the prevention of the problem.
Believe me, lifestyle, for people who have milder conditions, lifestyle changes can make a tremendous difference.
I mean, just getting back to psychedelics, yes, these are much safer drugs, but if you look at the studies, you're still rolling the dice. MDMA is being pushed as a treatment for trauma and PTSD. Well, maybe we should stop traumatizing people in the first place with domestic violence and war, but that's the bigger picture. But MDMA is being pushed as this treatment for PTSD. There's no doubt it's helpful for some people, but all the studies show there's a percentage of people that, they have additional panic attacks. Their anxiety gets worse. So we're still rolling the dice with these treatments, and we just need a certain amount of honesty instead of this kind of marketing hype. We have a big psychedelic marketing hype bubble right now, and it's hard to kind of find your way through that yes, these are safer than a lot of the other drugs out there. Yes, there are some risks as well. There's a lot of benefits that can come. The side effects are a lot less, but also you're taking a certain risk, and there's a lot of people that get relief from their pills, their drugs, their psychedelics, or whatever it is, and then after a while it kind of wears off, and they sort of like, it didn't really help, and then it's like, okay, well, what's the next thing that they're going to market for me?
I think I recently read a commentary somewhere that the fads in psychiatry don't change until there's a hero has arrived on the scene, and then they push out the prior miracle drug, and so now it's psychedelics or the miracle drug. But my theory of psychotropics is that, and this is across the board, is that it's hit or miss whether they're, effective for depression. They have studies showing that methadone can work for depression. They have studies showing that amphetamine can work for depression.
Cocaine works great for depression. Freud swore by cocaine for depression. So anything works, right? Any drug is going to change your consciousness.
All of these drugs will show extremely marginal effectiveness, and psychiatry will be all excited.
Fundamentally, if you really want to understand the mind, you have to sit down and talk to somebody. You can't just fall into what William James called medical materialism, or Jung called the psychology without the psyche. You can't just reduce human experience to levers being pulled in a chemical interaction in the brain. It's just madness. There's obviously a biological dimension to this, but think about a radio that is broadcasting music. Then can you reduce the music to the wires and the circuitry in the radio? Yeah, if you take away the wires in the circuitry, or you smash them, or you cut off the power, it's going to stop the music. But can you really understand what the music is about without understanding the nature of broadcasting and the nature of the larger context, that it's not reducible to the mechanical components of a radio? There's something else going on here. And all of the research on the mind points in that direction. All the research on the mind points that it's not actually something that can be explained by a biological deterministic model. There's something much, much more mysterious going on, and there's something much, much more relational, ecological, connected, and we just have not faced that in our understanding of mental health. We think that we're just walking around with computers in our brains, and that we just malfunction, and we just need to reboot ourselves, or add some new software, or have take it into the shop and get rewired, either physically or chemically. And the mind is not a computer. The mind is not a machine. There's a very, very serious misunderstanding. And if we continue to treat ourselves like machines, and treat the earth like a machine, and have a control model, then I think we're going to continue to get into more and more serious problems.
Well, Will, this may be where I can insert my own theory about how psychotropics work, and that is that you introduce the psychotropic, and the psychotropics does some scrambling in the network. So some of those scrambles people subjectively as being beneficial, and others don't feel anything at all. That explains your incredibly marginal results, is because you're getting null effects across the board from every darn psychotropic, where there's noise. It'll give you that tiny marginal advantage. Yeah, neuroscience can do all the imaging they want,
right?
But what you got is a slight variation in the signal coming from a dead fish.
Yeah, and when I say mystery, I'm not using the word mystery just as a casual. I'm saying there's a giant gap in our scientific knowledge about what the mind is and how it works and what is actually going on. One of the clearest examples I've come across is that there was an article in the Lancet years ago about an individual, completely normal individual, living a normal, so-called living a life, working, family, participating in society, not basically complaining about any kind of neurological condition. Turns out he's missing 90% of his brain matter. 90% is missing. He's only operating on 10. How is that even possible? It's not possible by the mechanistic, deterministic biological assumptions that we make about the mind and about brain. So we have to really recognize that we need some humility, that, we have to be very humble, that you can't just say chemistry causes consciousness. You have to realize that people are human beings. They're people with minds. They're not just brains inside of a skeletal scaffolding.
Well, I think that, the initial effect of antidepressants is that, that initial brain scrambling gets people off of their worry tracks. And then after that, there's the numbing. That's the benefit of it. And I don't, of course, some people don't experience it as a benefit. So it's not like they're miracle drugs.
Yeah, and some people are going to be benefited by scrambling and having a wild new experience. I mean, how many people have been knocked out of their difficult state by falling in love or having a change of work or having an incredible wilderness experience? I mean, lots of things can scramble your brain. So I'm wondering, how do we do non-toxic scrambling of the brain to get an effect? Why do we go with these toxic radical approaches, or maybe just fasting or something like the Wim Hof method? You can try different things without risking protracted withdrawal syndrome, because these are very, very powerful drugs and they're toxic. You take them at a certain dosage, they're going to kill you. And you're stepping into a realm of high risk. So you have to really be honest about the risks involved.
What I think would be great for everybody? Daytime raves.
Yeah, ecstatic dance or doing improv. I mean, there's lots of different ways to blow your mind and try different things. And also at the same time, being stuck is a really difficult spot. And even just a small change, just remembering to drink that glass of water, remembering to step outside into the sunshine, remembering to just hang on and just breathe and just know that another day is going to create new possibilities. So listen, I really want to encourage people to check out survivingantidepressants.org, the website, Adele, that you've been building and doing that work. And, we've been talking about simple things like you can't predict and you have to sort of follow your own path. And this is really supported by years and years of working with people around psychiatric drugs. And so, connect with communities, connect with the Surviving Antidepressants forums, and get a sense of what people are going through. And then that's going to help you and the people you care about to make better informed decisions. And ultimately, I think that it's about building connections with each other and being able to trust ourselves, so that when we meet each other, we're meeting each other in a really authentic way. And the connections that we build are really our true connections. Thank you so much, Adele Framer, for joining us today on Madness Radio. It's been great having you.
Thank you, Will.
You've been listening to an interview with alto strata, Adele Framer. She's the founder of survivingantidepressants.org, which is a support forum for all psychiatric drugs established in 2011. It has more than 500,000 hits per month. Thank you so much for joining us today on Madness Radio. Big thanks to Oddball Magazine for help with the production of this episode. Check out oddballmagazine.com. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio host is Will Hall. Producer is Nina Packebush. Madness Radio is an affiliate of Mad in America Radio, broadcasting on KBOO in Oregon, sponsored by Portland Hearing Voices and the Icarus Project, and syndicated on the Pacifica Network. Madness Radio is online at kboo.fm/madnessradio and at madinamerica.com.